This week's video is going to be something a little different and a little shorter. Today I'm going to be unboxing some custom terrain I got from Seth over at Seth of All Trades. On his channel, Seth goes into all sorts of different creative endeavors, from making dioramas to terrain and painting miniatures and cooking, all while exploring his ADHD and how he can channel that into all sorts of different endeavors. And I had watched his video on making a bridge piece of custom terrain, and I thought it was just super cool. So we connected and he made me and shipped to me some custom terrain that I will be using at Gen Con later this year for a river crossing scene. So let's cut over to me unboxing it for the first time and we'll show it off. I'm a big fan of using terrain and miniatures when I play in person with Dungeons & Dragons or any other role-playing game. And I know that's somewhat of a controversial take, because a lot of people believe that you don't really need all of that bric-a-brac, all of those toys. And I do agree. Really, at the end of the day, you're playing in an imagined space. But having been spoiled over the years with a really consistent D&D group that makes use of custom terrain, I've come to really appreciate what a little razzle-dazzle can do for a session. It's not so much that you need that terrain or that the terrain is required, but it's so immersive and fun to plop some really cool terrain down on the table and really just enjoy that moment with your friends, especially if it's something you made yourself. There's always been so much appreciation for a good custom setup whenever I've done it or the host of my normal D&D game does it. But there's some things you should consider before you start investing heavily in terrain. And the first of which is the cost. 3D terrain is significantly more expensive than simply using a dry erase mat or some cards, or really just not using anything at all. The more you invest in this, the more storage you need and the more cost you need. It can really start to balloon. Historically speaking, I've mostly just used a big dry erase mat with a grid on it, because, I can just draw something very fast and plop it down for the tactical play that is often needed for games like D&D. But my recent tastes have gone more toward abstracted distances rather than discrete measured distances like squares. So when I set up terrain at home, I'm often simply using abstracted distances and simply describe, okay, this is what close range would be, this is what long range would be, and we don't need to actually get out the measuring tape or use a grid. So when you're doing that, you can have terrain that is much more abstract or pleasant to look at because it doesn't have a grid overlaid on top. But you don't even necessarily need terrain down on the table. You can also just use wood blocks and tokens spread around to represent the 3D space. When I do get the chance though, something like what Seth put together is well worth splurging on, because boy, does it look cool. You can start to see the pieces coming out now in the video, and there's just so much detail and razzle-dazzle to it. You just know that if your players come to sit down at the table and you reveal this sort of terrain, they're going to be so intrigued and excited about how it's going to be used during that session. But the storage and maintenance of terrain is quite precarious. As you can see, Seth really wrapped this terrain up very carefully in bubble wrap with separating papers, because he knew that it's easily damaged in transit. It had to hop on a truck or an airplane to get to me. So one of the challenges I'm going to face with this terrain is how do I rebox it and store it safely so that the paint doesn't stick to the other pieces and the heat of where I live doesn't damage any of it as well. But even a setup like this isn't prohibitively expensive. A lot of this is just foam board and cardboard and a little bit of rubber. And none of that is particularly expensive when it comes to materials. The real challenge with this was simply that it took a lot of skill to make. I definitely wouldn't have the artistic ability to make something that looked this nice. When you're working with 3D terrain, remember that you're going to want to probably place miniatures on top of it if you're going analog. And so having mostly flat terrain is the play. You can see that Seth made them appear textured, but they're still flat so that you can place miniatures on top of them without them falling over all the time. And if you're pretty clumsy like me, you end up knocking miniatures over all the time when you're playing in person, so the more stable the structure, the better. Now, you may not be able to tell all that clearly in this video, but Seth actually drilled little magnets into the sides of the pieces so that they lightly magnetize together. It's not enough that they lock in place, like snap into place really firmly, but it's enough to keep them mostly together when they're sitting on the table, resistant to light nudging and such, which is nice. It's a really smart quality of life thing he added to them. The waterfall is this piece of, I'm not sure what he made it of. It's kind of this rubbery material that just kind of sticks to the side of the rocks, and it looks so cool. The nice thing about using 3D terrain without a grid is you don't need to worry about the scale as much. So this scene is going to be using wagons and horses and players, and these wagons are not to scale for this scene, but that's all right, because I'll be using abstracted distances. I could simply say that it's a close distance between the middle of the river and the sides of the river, right? Up off the embankment where some of those wagons are. And even these wagons are not particularly expensive. They're only a few dollars each, and then a friend painted them for me. I got them as kits that I needed to assemble, just pieces of plastic, but even that wasn't very hard for somebody as unskilled as I am. A pro tip for getting lots of inexpensive miniatures to dress up your scenes is actually to look for children's play kits. Here you can see me using little rubber horses that I got for pennies each in a big packet that had horses and cows and so forth. And they just add a lot to the scene when you put them in. I also tend to use children's building block toys. Just a box of them is maybe $15 for just dozens and dozens of building blocks. You can use them for pillars and walls and all sorts of stuff. Now these miniatures that I'm using are more expensive. These are Hero Forge custom minis that are printed in color. So those were definitely pricier, and I used gift cards that I had gotten for my birthday for these rather than pay for them outright. But if you can splurge on minis, they can really help immerse, as these minis are the pre-gen characters for the Clockworld playtest. So these actually match up with the characters that I'll be running at Gen Con. I couldn't be happier with the result. Super cool terrain. I can't wait to run it at Gen Con later this year. So if any of you are going to be at Gen Con, try to track me down or sign up for some of the Tales from Elsewhere sessions that we're going to be running. I hope to see some of the community there. I think it would be so fun. Well, anyway, I hope you enjoyed taking a look at that terrain, and we'll see you next week on Tales from Elsewhere.